During 2024 Philadelphia Eagles training camp, who have Gino and I been the most right about and the most wrong about, plus the biggest surprises at camp? We'll get into all that and more on this Monday.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Welcoming Eagles fans to this Monday edition of the show. I'm Louis DiBiase, joined as always by Gino Camilleri. We're brought to you by FanDuel. Now through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5 and get a 3-week free trial of NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. That's right. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get started. The NFL regular season is right around the corner. We've got one more preseason game to really see who's going to make this Eagles 53-man roster. Gino, I'm sure some of the guys that will be on the team aren't on the team right now. I'm sure there's trades to come, waiver wire pickups, free agent signings. But right now there's a lot of guys still battling. So we got one more big game for them to really make an impact. And I think there are still, I don't think the 53 is like set in stone. I think there's still a lot of guys that could earn a spot or play their way off the team.
One of the things that we always say every year is that even come cutdown day, you're not guaranteed a roster spot because you know there will be another influx of guys that will be added via the waiver cut down because every roster is going to go from 90 to 53.
Yeah,
so
there's not two cuts anymore. It's just one big wave.
37 guys times 32 teams, just do the math. That's several hundred players that are going to now be thrown out into the waiver wire. And some of the older vested veterans, they don't have to go through waivers and they become automatic free agents. But especially with the depth on this Eagles team, Lou, there's still a lot of musical chairs going on. And we talked about this last week before the game, and we're still talking about it now, especially on offense. Depth is going to be huge, especially at wide receiver, maybe even tight end. I think running back set in stone, but man, those premier pass catching positions outside of the big names, who's to say what jobs have already been won? I can't say any of them have been won, if we're being honest.
No, I completely agree. And when you look at right now, the big battles have been, and for starting jobs, it's really just like wide receiver 3, if you consider that a starting job, which it is because the Eagles use 11 personnel the majority of the time. There's right guard, and there's CB2, and then, of course, inside linebacker. Like, those have been the top 4 battles. I'd say of the 4, I don't know, I think one is definitely set in stone. Like, you know, you probably agree, Mekhi Becton is going to be the starting right guard in Brazil against Green Bay. The other 3, though, are still wide open. Like, I thought linebacker Zach Bond was going to get the job, and he still gets a lot of the first-team reps next to Devin White. But Nakobe Dean is having a hell of a 2-week stretch, and he's been maybe the Eagles' best linebacker on the field in that time where they wanted him to win the job already. He really wasn't, especially in coverage, and now that he is, I think all of the other 3 spots are open. Although CB2 feels like it's Isaiah Rodgers' job to lose, but I think Becton is the only one that's like set in stone as of right now heading into this 3rd game.
And I would honestly couple the Mekhi Becton decision, or we'll see if it is a firm decision. Nick Sirianni didn't sign off on it, but we know how coach speak can be. And if you just look at who played last week versus who didn't play, Mekhi Becton has won that job. And I would say that's arguably one of the most surprising winners, because if you were to go back and say at the time when they signed Mekhi Becton with the inevitable plan of what Tyler Steen should become, you're saying, oh, this guy's just going to be a swing tackle for you, a high-end swing tackle at that, and he's only going to see the field if there is an injury.
Yeah, I did not predict he'd be starting at right guard at all.
Yeah, and that ridiculous statement that you said that he's going to be starting against the Packers in Brazil, like say that 20 years ago to a fan that the Eagles would be kicking off the season in Brazil, but you're 100% correct. You got to put the best 5 guys out there, and the way that the Eagles have looked at that right guard position, it kind of makes sense that Mekhi Becton won that job. You talk about what they want in terms of a mauler in the run game. You want a little bit more length and size when it comes to that position. Cam Jurgens was kind of an outlier, but the plan at that position, if you look at Howie Roseman's track record, it's draft the guy with a 1, 2, or 3 round pick in terms of an offensive lineman,
Yep.
let them sit for a year or two, and then they inevitably win the job. He's done that time and time again. Well, now we're sitting here saying a street free agent in Mekhi Becton won the job over Tyler Steen, and Tyler Steen deserves to start, in my opinion. I think he's put together enough tape, and even last year in moments he looked good enough to start for you, and he looked more polished in his time. He needs to get healthy more than anything right now, because that
Yeah.
can really hinder them. But color me shocked that Mekhi Becton
I'm
is the
surprised too.
starter for this team.
And I'm not surprised over the last month that that's what's transpired. But if you would ask me from like April to July, that
Yeah,
version of me, I would be
100%.
very surprised, because Tyler Steen was a top pick, a top 3-round pick, as you mentioned. Normally they give that guy a shot. Even in Isaac Seumalo, it was a third-round pick. Like Cam Jurgens, those guys get the opportunities. He comes from a big school in Alabama. Lane Johnson, Jeff Stoutland hyped him up. He got some Brandon Brooks comparisons. Like, I thought last year he handled everything pretty well. They didn't draft an offensive lineman early on in this past draft. So I'm like, oh, it's going to be Tyler Steen's job. Do think that was the original plan, but I think Becton almost made them realize, Gino, what they want in the position. Like, once they got Becton on the field, they're like, whoa, like this is a length, a power that we don't really have in Steen. Because I mentioned this in the podcast last week. It's like, if Steen wasn't supposed to be the starting right guard, or you switched up the minute he had an injury, like if this was always the plan, or you never really wanted him to have that job, then what was the original plan when you drafted him? I mean, that's the interesting part. He was a tackle in school, but it did feel like when they drafted him, they labeled it as a guard. So I think originally this was the plan.
Around the time of the draft, though, we were saying that since they didn't draft an offensive lineman, that maybe he is the heir apparent at right tackle and is more of a swing tackle. But you talk about,
Maybe they've switched up and that's the plan now. I don't know.
I'm looking at it because, to your point, when you made that signing of Mekhi Becton way back when, I'm thinking of our perspective. If you were to say Tyler Steen was not the starter, it probably would have been, if we were to guess, that he just didn't live up to what
That's
they
probably what it
expected him.
is.
And
Yep.
I would say he's lived up to that. And I don't want to take away anything. I think Mekhi Becton, to your point, forced their hand and
Yeah,
said,
they're
this
looking at a
guy's
ceiling perspective, not a floor. Because Steen has a good floor, like you mentioned. But
yeah, and I think he'll be the guy moving forward. And obviously,
Yeah.
you're probably only going to get 1 year out of Becton, but you're like, oh man, we can really force the issue
I don't
in
think they
what
can
we
help
want to do in the
themselves.
run game. And
Yeah.
Jeff Stoutland's probably salivating every time he walks into the building. And he's like,
Yeah, I don't
hey,
think
Howie,
this
I
was
don't
the
care who
original-
you drafted. I'm going to
Yes,
throw
I
my
agree.
guy out there.
No, I agree. I don't think this was the original plan. I think they saw it at camp and they're like, brain blast. What if we use that length and giant size that normally isn't a guard? What if it does work though, in between Lane and next to an undersized?
He didn't
lineman
even
in Cam
expect it
Jurgens?
either. Every time they
No, not
asked
at all.
him, he said that wasn't the plan when he came here.
They switched up quick, and I think they wanted to try it out, and the Steen injury gave them the opening, and they jumped on it. And we'll see what happens. I mean, Becton wasn't perfect this summer. I don't think he was amazing in the preseason either. So I don't think he's like locked in at right guard. Tyler Steen could play this year, but for now, they're going to take the ceiling approach over the floor. So that's the position battle that's over. I would say the second one that's closest to being over, although I don't think it's justified. Maybe it is based on camp play, but if it's based on preseason tape, Keely Ringo, in my opinion, would be the CB2, Gino, but it sounds like Rodgers has this gig.
I would say that if we were going to say the most shocking, the least shocking, and the one that's kind of just battling out status quo, this is probably the status quo, in my opinion, that we figured these guys would go toe to toe, and like you can kind of pick your flavor of ice cream.
Yeah, none of them would have really surprised you, right?
Yeah, if you wanted to go with the more bigger body type of guy that probably offers a little less agility side to side, a little less hip mobility, you go with Keely Ringo. But if you wanted to go with the guy who's more raw, let's say, and hasn't been on the field and has a lot of room to continue to grow in this defense, you probably go with Isaiah Rodgers. But at the end of the day, neither is a bad choice. And
neither
I'm
will
with
be
you
the
on
starting
Keely.
base outside, though, Gino. It sounds like Quinyon Mitchell, when they have two corners out there, he's going to be the outside guy, and then we'll move inside when they're in nickel.
And this week told us a lot when Cooper DeJean came back for these team portions that they want to throw him in the nickel position. They want him to be inside, and that moving Quinyon to the second corner position in base, that's a good indication of the future of this football team, because you were worried about sticking him in nickel.
Yeah.
He might have to play outside if things don't work out.
You mentioned a really good point earlier, how even if you make the roster with that first wave of cuts, doesn't mean you're safe. If Becton won the job, Isaiah Rodgers probably won this job. If it's Nakobe Dean or Zach Bond at inside linebacker, none of these guys are set in stone long term, man. Like Vic Fangio, if you don't look great 3 to 4 weeks in, they might say Isaiah Rodgers isn't getting it done. Maybe instead of Ringo on the outside, let's put Quinyon out there and move DeJean inside. So they've got the job for now, but they're not married to any of this, really. Because none of these guys are top picks that they invested a lot in.
But the one thing that I think played out as we expected is that one of these guys was going to battle it out and win a competition, that it wasn't just going to be handed to either of these guys, that they both have the ability to be that number 2 cornerback. And are things playing out to the best that they could right now in that secondary room?
I was saying, are you happy with the result? Because you're right.
I am.
So they are like, they're preaching what they're walking the walk, like they talk about competition, because they're not just handing the jobs to the picks they made, right? They're not handing the job to Tyler Steen. Becton won it. They're not handing the job to Ringo or Quinyon, who they drafted instead of, they didn't draft Isaiah Rodgers, right? They are not just handing the job to Nakobe Dean. You want those guys to win the job. Right now, it looks like really only Dean has. I don't know if that, again, though, is a reflection of the draft picks. Like, I don't think Steen failed in this battle.
No.
Quinyon absolutely did not, and same with Ringo. And Dean's playing really well. So I'm okay with the result because I don't think the draft picks have been bad.
You've just also added on good football players in terms of the free agents that you've added to this group as well. And trade in Isaiah Rodgers' situation, but this is the best of both worlds when the draft picks are forcing your hand and the guys that you brought in are pushing the envelope.
And those guys aren't Band-Aids, they're former top picks themselves. They're young players that could have a future here too. Rodgers and Becton aren't Nicholas Morrow, right?
And the way you look at the idea of a Band-Aid can be, I think, misconstrued, because some people might just say, oh, we didn't sign anybody, so we're just signing this person to fill in a spot. That's not what that's not what Isaiah Rodgers is. That's not what Mekhi Becton is.
The only one like that to me is Zach Bond,
And even Bond, I mean, he's taking on a new role you didn't even know he was going to be. If you sign just like another version of Zach Cunningham or Miles Jack, then that's a Band-Aid signing. But you're at least trying to push these guys' ceiling a little bit in different positions. I mean, Isaiah Rodgers hasn't played in a year and a half. You didn't even know if he could play football when you think about it. Mekhi Becton never played guard. Zach Bond never played inside linebacker. So that was never just the plan. It was never just, oh, we're going to grab this pack of Band-Aids off of the shelf. This is going to be what it is. They at least brought these guys in betting on traits, betting on athleticism, and their coach's ability to develop them. You talk about the best of both worlds, Lou. Well, if the free agents are picking up this defense and offense as quickly as they are, and the young guys are developing quicker than we expected, is this a bad situation to be in at the end of the day? Not one bit.
It would be bad if they all looked bad and they're putting out there like a 32-year-old instead of the young
Ronald Darby is back in this equation.
If Ronald Darby's playing over Rasul Douglas, but Isaiah Rodgers, I want Ringo probably on the outside more than Rodgers right now. I want Quinyon eventually there, but Rodgers is a young, fast player that could be your long-term outside guy opposite Quinyon Mitchell. Like, that is a scenario. So I'm not, the only result that of these battles we're talking about that I won't love is if Zach Bond is playing over Nakobe Dean and Jeremiah Trotter Jr. But there's still time for that. Dean has been crushing, and they're all going to play anyway, because none of these spots outside of Becton is, a position, where they're not rotating.
And the one with Nakobe Dean, I would say it's kind of the least surprising to you and I, because we always said, like, what is his ceiling? If he hits the ceiling, there's nobody in this unit that could kind of match what he presents. And man, if he plays with the physicality and the range and just that grittiness, that really was kind of the selling point to why he would become a really good Philadelphia Eagle. You look at an undersized type of guy, you have to be that come downhill. I'm going to blow up the running back
Yeah.
in pass protection. I'm also going to be the guy that can rip out to the flat when you want to dump it out. And I'm going to just come downhill with 110% ferocity. And he showed that. But if he's healthy, there was never a question about who the best linebacker in that room was, Lou. In our opinion, it was him. And then everybody else is just keeping you afloat. He can elevate the rest of that group, man. If he hits his ceiling, that's a good player to have in your back pocket, man. And the rest of the group, it looks like they're really pushing the equation in terms of competition all around the board.
It's been a lot of positive and negative surprises throughout training camp. We'll get into that coming up next. Plus, who Gino and I have been the most right and wrong about so far throughout camp. So we'll get into all that and more coming your way on this Monday edition of Locked On Eagles. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast is brought to you by eBay Motors. Passion, drive, and patience. The formula for winning championships. It's also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and to level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. With all the parts you need at the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and to bring home huge wins. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions do apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Thanks for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, make sure your second listen is the Locked On Fantasy Football Podcast. Get daily insight to the best fantasy draft strategies so you can win your league this season, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Gino, what do you feel like when it comes to like your predictions from camp, your expectations, takes you've had on the podcast? Where do you think you were the most right about a player in camp? And then where do you think you were maybe the most wrong about a guy in a good or bad way?
Ooh, this is an interesting discussion because we can look at it in terms of how they fit the Eagles and in terms of their overall skill set, if they've lived up to the hype, if they've underperformed. I would say maybe my evaluation of Jalyx Hunt and how quickly it would take him to get into the swing of an NFL like game speed and just keeping up with how fast these guys are as opposed to playing down there at Houston Baptist. And it kind of goes against everything that I look at when it comes to scouting, because you're saying, oh, this guy has every trait you can imagine. You drafted him high because he tested out of the world and you see his ceiling. But at the same time, I thought he was going to be slow to pick it up because he played under the radar, played at a smaller school. And he fits the part to a T, man. Like, that might be the most shocking how quickly he was able to pick it up. But that's part of the evaluation process that we will never know. Like, we don't know how quickly he can learn football and how smart he is as a ball player unless we were interviewing him. And man, he has took this thing and taken it in stride. He looks to be exactly what Fangio wants in that overhang hybrid type of edge player. And benefit to the Eagles, man, they got quite the plethora there on the edge that you're not saying one of these guys needs to step up. They kind of all are stepping up in their own regard. And hats off to Nolan Smith as well in that equation.
Yeah, we're on the same wavelength there. I wrote down the same thing, that I was the most wrong, I feel like, about Jalyx Hunt. And not that I thought he was going to be bad, because we both loved the pick and we knew the upside was there, but kind of thought he was a redshirt this year. That he
timeline we were wrong on.
Timeline, we're like, it's a year 2, year 3 kind of project, because this year you still got Josh Sweat for at least one more year, Bryce Huff, Nolan Smith, and Brandon Graham ahead of him in the pecking order. Can he find snaps as that fifth guy replacing like what Patrick Johnson was? Like, yeah, you saw Patrick Johnson on the field at times since 2021, but not that much. So I agree with you with Jalyx Hunt. I think the guy that I was most right about, I would say, is probably Quinyon Mitchell, but even Gino, I'm still surprised. Like, I don't think I was as right about him as I thought, because I didn't think he was going to play in the slot and to play as well as he has in the slot, not just in coverage, man on man, zone, but the way he's run fitting, the way he's tackling. Like, it's so impressive to me. And especially, like, yeah, he's a first round pick, but I don't think it's said enough. Like, when you're turning heads like this, going up against two of the best receivers in the league every single day, that is not an easy, like, welcome to the NFL first training camp to have to cover Devontae Smith and A.J. Brown, especially in one-on-ones. Like, you're getting no help from safeties. Like, that's tough.
It's kind of one of those picks that you see and you're like, oh yeah, we were kind of right about this right away. It's
Just feels like
tough to
they nailed it
imagine.
already. And he hasn't played a game, but it feels like it feels kind of like the Devontae Smith pick, in 2021, where instantly you're like, oh yeah, this is exactly who we thought we were getting.
Right, but the thing with Quinyon Mitchell, it's like the parameters fit too when it comes to size, when it comes to athleticism. Devontae was such an outlier where you're like, oh,
Yeah.
if he doesn't work out, it could be
Right.
a drastic failure. But when it comes to Quinyon Mitchell, unless he, knock on wood, doesn't stay healthy and like suffers some sort of setback that's going to kill his straight line speed, his ability to cover, and his hips just aren't as oily as they are right now. Unless that happens, which I don't see it happening, he's going to work out at minimum to be a starting nickel corner for you because Vic Fangio, who's been around the league, he can identify talent and knows what he wants in his guys. If he's saying this guy can play that position, even though he's never played it before, it's like the Cam Jurgens playing guard type of thing where it's like, at worst, we have a starting guard. At worst, we have a nickel corner that we're going to be able to play forever. But he seems to be the number one guy, man. And I want him to take on those assignments. And it starts with practice going against AJ and Devontae, right? Like you can lose a whole bunch of confidence going against those guys each day and say, how am I ever going to get to this skill level? How am I ever going to defend this sort of speed, athleticism, just this overall physical toughness? And man, he's the quiet assassin, as people like to say. He doesn't say much, but he talks with his work on the field, and just been 2 games with a couple reps here and there, but he looks the part through and through already.
Completely agree. Is there anybody for you feel like you had certain expectations for heading into camp and you're like, yep, exactly what we're getting?
I think we got to talk about our quarterback, and there was a lot of unfair criticism, I think, like said his way, and a lot of people want to make the stories about him and Nick Sirianni, and Jalen. He goes about his business and just doesn't listen to any of the outside noise, and you're looking at a kid who's having one of the better camps we've seen from a quarterback in Philadelphia Eagles history over the last 10 or 15 years or so, and it just comes with him being a smart football player, understanding Kellen Moore's offense right away. And you look at other starters around the league that are playing in the preseason and stuff, Daniel Jones, and not looking all too great. Jalen Hurts was saying, we don't even want to put this guy on the field because we know the expectation and what he is going to bring to us already. And when the reports are that he's had like 1 or 2 missteps all of camp, got to feel confident in your guy leading the charge and your quarterback.
I completely agree. Let's get into some surprises coming up next as we wrap up this Monday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast.
We roll along this episode of LOEs brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. You've heard us talk a lot about FanDuel, which is America's #1 sports book, by the way. Well, we have something a little different for you. Right now, through September 22nd, all FanDuel customers can bet $5, a single Abraham Lincoln, and get a free 3-week trial to NFL Sunday Ticket from YouTube and YouTube TV. With YouTube TV base plan, all you have to do is watch every regular season game Sunday afternoon that is out of market. All you need is a Google account, a current form of payment, and you can cancel at any time. Just visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook, and that's a $5 bet. You're going to get a free 3-week trial of NFL Sunday Ticket. That's the best offer FanDuel is ever going to give, if we're being honest. Get back in the swing of things with the NFL over at FanDuel. Go to FanDuel.com/lockedon to download America's #1 sportsbook.
All right, we're wrapping up this Monday edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast, talking about the biggest surprises throughout the 2024 training camp offseason. I think, you could look at this through a positive lens, same with negative. I would say the guy that I've been most pleasantly surprised about, and this is a player that was my guy in the 2023 draft class, loved him, thought he was going to be a day 2 pick, not a day 3 pick, but kind of like Jalyx Hunt, I am surprised how far along he is and how just dominant he looks, where it was I thought he was going to have a certain role of being like that fifth guy in the rotation on the defensive line, but suddenly like Moro Ojomo looks, I mean, the tape against New England was awesome, both against the run and when it comes to getting the quarterback. He is going to play, I think, a lot this year, especially if Jordan Davis is not that effective as a pass rusher, if Milton Williams kind of plateaus. There's a role for Ojomo this year.
I've been pleasantly surprised with a lot of the depth on the
Yeah, like
interior of the
Tui
defensive
Pelotu
line.
too. Like those two, Ojomo and Tui Pelotu have rocked this summer.
Talk about my guy, Thomas Booker, the
Yeah, Booker
tweener out
too.
of Stanford,
The young
man.
DTs look way better than I thought.
He had back-to-back plays with a sack in the last game. And then at practice, he was utterly dominant, apparently,
Yeah,
in
he's making the team.
one-on-ones. The decisions they have to make on that interior of the defensive line, some teams around the NFL are going to get lucky to grab some of these guys. But you're right, man. You turn on that tape, Ajomo was flying off the
Like
football,
destroying
man.
double teams. He was electric.
And you just see, I think the easiest way to tell instincts with a defensive lineman is just how quickly they could get off that ball without even having to look at it, man. And he was so in sync getting off the ball. You see, even though he's a little bit undersized in terms of like how he's not the most wide shouldered guy, but he has that crazy length that just allows him to latch on, and he has really good hand placement at the point of attack. And they do a really good job coaching those guys up. And it's great when you have Jalen Carter and Jordan Davis to teach this really young group, and they're going to cycle these guys through with no hesitation, Lou. Like, this is going to be a true committee approach at that position. And I mean, how many are you going to dress on game day? 6, 7 on the interior? It's going to be a tough decision who they're going to play in when they have to make a decision of 46 guys. Like, even though you're cutting down to 53, you're not dressing all of them on game day.
Who's somebody that maybe you're surprised hasn't stepped up as much this camp compared to what we expected?
I want to give flowers to one person real quick, Jeremiah Trotter Jr. I think also another guy who got a lot of unfair criticism in the draft process and didn't test, and people said, oh, is he a good athlete, yada yada. Well, the guy can play football. I don't care what you want to call him. And man, they got the heck of a 5th round draft pick in him. And talk about a day 3 pick that hasn't lived up to the hype. And
that's a good one. Yeah.
Maybe not the hype, but like what we thought he could be. Anais Smith, I think it's what we thought he could be coming out of A&M right away in this offense. It's like, oh, perfect. A field stretcher, gadget type of player, get the ball in his hand. Like, it will take advantage of having a lot of that underneath area to work with. And man, he can't win many of his one-on-ones in camp, apparently. And then outside of that 2-point conversion play, that it was a nice play, a nice little jet motion across the formation to get him into the flat, looked the ball in, got the 2-point conversion. You made the comparison of the Donnell Pumphrey, like he just doesn't look the part yet.
Quickly, you're like, oh no, we may have messed up fast.
I don't think it's Donnell where it's like, oh, you drafted him at a position where you're going to hand the ball off to him, which I thought was crazy drafting him back then. But you talk about a wide receiver who you want to see that explosiveness and that like next gear right away when you watch him.
And you don't see
you're just
it.
struggling to see that in his game speed right now.
Not to compare him to Jalen Reagor, but Reagor was a similar way where 1st round pick, the whole label around it was the Eagles need to get faster. Well, here's this 4-3 straight line runner from TCU. But then when you looked on the field, you're like, wait, this is the fast guy? Like, he looked stiff. And you're like, wait, this is the guy that's going to make this offense more athletic. And it just wasn't there. And it's kind of like that. Of course, it's a 5th round pick, so it's different. But you're right, Gino. It's like Anais Smith. You look at the tape, and it's like, here's this perfect pre-snap gadget for Kellen Moore. And when you look on the field, it's like he looks like just a guy. I mean, I don't know.
Especially with the guys that he's lining up with, too.
It's he kind of blends in. There's nothing that looks special about him.
Here's a good one for you. When you see a guy of his stature, and then you see Will Shipley as well, and then you see the differences in their game.
Shipley has way more juice.
Got more wiggle. He can
way more.
Got easy hands, and like he sees the field a little bit better. Where with Smith, you're like, okay, this is an undersized player. What am I seeing when it comes to the flashes? Like I'm just not seeing it yet.
At
And
least with
it's
Quez, like Gino,
early in his
Quez
development.
flamed out, but like you knew with Watkins that the first time he touched the football against the Cardinals in 2020, took the ball to the house off a screen. Like you saw the wiggle, the instant 0 to 100 explosiveness.
And his 50-50 ability you saw in the preseason
Yeah,
too. There
with
isn't like
Anias, you
that
don't get
one
that.
feature with Anias. Yeah, I
No.
think we're there. And Johnny Wilson he has to show it in the games. Like we've heard about it in camp, but
Yeah, I
just
haven't seen it yet, but
the
it's all
young
on
pass,
hearsay.
just all the young pass catchers as a whole outside of Brayton Covey, I would say like these guys did not step up, and kind of shocked. I mean, they bet on traits, they bet on guys that are on other practice squads like the Austin Watkins of the world, and they drafted 2 guys, and hopefully it's not a John Hightower Quez Watkins situation
Let's hope
again,
not.
and one of those guys works out. But all in all, I think the youth is really working out, and maybe Will Shipley might, now that we're talking about it, might be the biggest surprise. Like I didn't know what he was going
Yeah,
to
he's
be
got a
right
gear I
away,
didn't
and
think he had, and he has
he's going to be a
instant wiggle.
mismatch problem for some
No,
teams.
I agree. I think, and I want to put this in perspective. Like, I'm negatively surprised in a way. Like Nolan Smith, I don't think he looks bad. I don't think he's a bust. He has 2 sacks in 2 preseason games, Gino. But I will say I'm surprised like he doesn't look more refined as a pass rusher heading into year 2. Like his counter moves still seem like they're kind of sloppy. He kind of gets stuck if he doesn't win off that first initial bend. He gets sacks because he has such an awesome motor and he's so fast. Like he just never says die. So worst case, like this is going to be a really good rotational player for you, right? Just a grinder. But I am like a little disappointed that I don't want to say he looks the same as last year, but on tape in these preseason games, it doesn't look like he's taken like a massive jump, and we'll see in the regular season. But I'm a little surprised in that way.
We'll wait to see on him.
Yeah,
The
it's still up in the
preseason's
air,
more.
but
I think how I evaluate the preseason now, especially after 7 years of doing this show, is like, can these guys just match the speed of the rest of the players around the league?
it's a fair way to
Like,
evaluate it.
can they see the field quickly enough? Like, can they get to the right spot? And Nolan Smith, when he was out there last week, man, that ghost rush, it's like, I don't know if there was another guy on the field that could have like
No, I know. It's
put his
just
foot
like,
in the
do you
dirt,
have
clicked
another
and
move
closed
though?
down.
It's not the
Yeah,
ghost rush.
we got to
we'll
see him evolve, and that's why we love scouting and love the whole evaluation process here, is because it is holistic. It's not just, oh, this player is what he is at this current point in time. What is the next step for a lot of these guys? It's been great through 2 weeks. Got one more example come Saturday, but man,
Yep.
it's gonna be fast and furious when the bullets are flying down there in Brazil. So these guys either got to step up, or some of these surprises that we are surprised aren't stepping up.
Yeah.
They might be sinking in quicksand a little quicker than we thought.
Like you said, they got one more big test Saturday to try to make the case that they should be on this football team in 2024. We have one more 53-man roster prediction before that game. We'll do that tomorrow, then 3 more shows for you after that this week. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast, your first listen each and every day. Make sure your second listen, get ready for your Locked On or your fantasy football drafts with Locked On Fantasy Football. Until then, though, for Gino Camilleri, I'm Lou DiBiase signing off. Thanks so much for downloading, watching, and listening, and let's go Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.